The question for today is, how can I stay grounded and connected when I or the other person is triggered? Um, this may be a side question. It's like, what does it actually take to live these principles of nonviolent communication when things get heated?
Yeah, the metaphor of martial arts comes to mind because it's one thing to practice martial arts in a dojo, and it's another to be prepared for what happens outside the dojo on the street. And I'm remembering a book called Mastery by an Aikido master whose name, unfortunately, I don't remember at the moment. And he was talking about how, as a very new student, his teacher said, okay, we're going to do this practice now, or practice this move. And he spoke up and said, but we've already done that. And then he said, when he's writing the book, he said, probably by now I've done that 50,000 times. And that is what leads to the muscle memory, the unconscious competence, the mastery. And I think there's something similar here. The first thing is to create some order and actually to know what is skillful. And then to start to train in those skills, which at first take perhaps some very concerted effort and focus and intention. And then we assimilate them more and more, and then we'll have access to them in a growing spectrum of challenge or of difficulty, instead of regressing to just whatever the reactive default is, or the fight activation expressed through a certain relational operating system. So one of the first things that I teach, as those who've learned with me know, although some other teachers save this for much later on, is the basic complementarity between what I call throwing and catching, meaning a conscious clarity around where is the focus right now. Is our focus on you, on hearing what's important to you, which is different from our focus being on you to prove you wrong, uh, or to focus on how what you're saying is wrong. Rather, is our focus on you to catch what's core, that's alive to you, for you? Or is our focus on me expressing and you catching, and me sharing what's important to me and being received in that? So there's a couple elements there. Yeah, there's this one, who's throwing, who's catching, and needing those to be matching. Because often what happens when there's a charge is that that matching falls away, and whoever was catching, instead of catching, goes to throwing their own piece. And then there's two people throwing and no one catching. So then usually, or often, people try and throw harder. And the other person throws harder. So that's an escalation. That's the anatomy of an argument. It escalates, and then somebody either withdraws or gives in. But that quality of giving in is certainly not the same as catching, being touched, and giving to. Yeah, in the space of care, it becomes a resentful giving in. And even though there's a giving in, there's still distance. There's still kind of loneliness in that. So that's one element, is of our kind of basic training, which we might not used to be being conscious of that, to tracking that, and to being able to switch on a dime, in a moment, in the heat of a moment, to catching when there's something so important to me that I want to be caught. And then there's also what are we actually catching, which is very different from like, oh, how do I pretend that I agree with you so as to pacify you when actually I don't. That's the direction of connection through agreement, which most of us are used to. Oh, we can connect if we have the same opinion. But if we don't have the same opinion or the same preference, then there's polarization. Then we get stuck in this either or and the seeming notion or seeming reality of scarcity. And then somebody's got to give in. But instead, if we focus on a different level of experience, a more foundational or fundamental level of experience, which in NVC we call needs, or someone called life needs, basic core needs. My brother Jack calls them the cares at the core. Those are universal. That's where we can always find resonance, even if we don't agree about the surface position or whatever. So those are two kind of foundational skills which we do need to train thousands of times and across situations so that when we're triggered, we won't just regress, respond from reactivity through a blaming, shaming, guilting, using our power, etc. But actually, we can move into skillfulness, like an Aikido master. If someone comes to attack them, they can join that movement and redirect it in a minimally harmful way. So those are two basic skills, but there may be a kind of intermediary step, and I'll focus for now on if I'm triggered. So if I'm triggered, what can I do to create more space inside so that I can actually really have access to choice that is beyond the either or of just express my reactivity or suppress my reactivity. Neither of those tend to work out so well. If it's just express my reactivity, it tends to make a mess. Or if I suppress it, it creates a lot of pressure or resentment inside. And I might be pretending to be nice or something, but either I or you or both of us are going to pay the cost of that later. There's no congruence, there's no genuineness. It certainly doesn't work well in the long term, and perhaps not in the short term either. So what can I do if I'm super triggered? One first move that I find can be really helpful and quite accessible for most people is what I call internal disinhibition. So it's like if my kind of raw reactivity would express if there were no inhibition as cursing, swearing, whatever, I allow that inside. I don't speak it out loud to the other person. That would probably make a mess. But I can allow it inside, and allowing it inside doesn't even mean that I believe it. It doesn't mean I think, oh, that swearing, that's true, or that it just means, oh, that's a way that for some of us, our raw, unvarnished reactivity expresses itself. And when I just, instead of applying so much pressure inside to put the brakes on that, which might be better than saying it out loud, but it takes a lot of constant effort and is creating distance as well. I just open more space inside and I let that voice speak, or I speak it in my head and I say, whatever those words may be. And when I do that, I generally find that all it takes is literally a few seconds. Because what happens is in those few seconds, there's actually a bit of an increase in the activation, in the intensity, and then it reaches a threshold. Like any wave, at some point crests. There's no wave that keeps going forever. I mean, if we get lost in it and identified with it, then it can go on and on and on and on. But if we just if we just speak that voice inside and we're kind of feeling ourselves at the same time, we'll notice there's a threshold. It'll be like, ah, yeah, then there's that breath that comes. And then that's the off ramp. And then I take that off ramp, ah, and then there's a bit more space inside. And then with that more space, I probably have more access to my inner resources, to my adult consciousness. And then I can start to feel myself and listen inside more deeply. So that's the next step. I
Can
can
I
start
pause
to,
you?
yeah,
Yeah. Just want to take a moment with this first step, like just open it up a bit with you. A few questions came up. Like, I guess the first one was, is this something you actually um, you do yourself, or ultimately you would suggest doing in the moment?
yeah,
You
it
don't remove
is.
yourself.
Yeah, both of those. I do this sometimes myself. And yes, I think it's like a very helpful emergency self empathy move in the heat of the moment to just let that come up inside, not speak it out, but just let it come up while feeling ourselves so that we notice when we hit the threshold. We don't get lost in the story. And like I said, I don't have to believe that. It's just, oh, if that's how it comes, like I didn't decide, oh, I'm going to take a deep breath. I mean, that might be helpful as well, but there's something about, oh, just allowing that increase. And then the deep breath comes by itself. And then I surf the out breath into more grounding.
Okay, so this not getting identified with the thought or this story, these judgments, can you just maybe say more about how you feel yourself? I think were your words, or how you stay in tune with
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah. Noticing my body. Yeah. So I might speak those voices. Ah, oh, she's so a fucking idiot. Ah, I can't believe this is happening again. Ah. And I'm feeling my body. And then I feel like, oh, there's this point, and then like there's kind of increase, and then oh, there's that movement. And then I let go of the cursing, the words, the thought, the story, and I focus my attention on that somatic or body feeling of a bit of a settling. And then that helps me come more into presence, more into myself, lower down, more fully.
I feel like just of adding here, like this is a skill, a big skill of awareness and of ability to really, yeah. I mean, I'm in a moment. I'm just imagining myself. I'm in a moment where someone's triggered me. I imagine it's not the first time this person's triggered me, and and I'm essentially trying to rewire or create a new movement inside me. And there's so much momentum going to the movement of the story and the wave. So I'm trying to really, reverse that process and bring in a lot of presence. So perhaps what I'm just wanting to say here is, and you tell me your thoughts on it, Danny, but like perhaps choosing the situations to begin this practice with in terms of how triggering are they might be a helpful like first step. Like perhaps this is not the thing to do with that partner of yours or your mother or whoever it is which really triggers you. Do you see this as a practice where, start with something that's maybe a bit less charging or not necessarily?
Mm, well, for one, you know, anyone could just explore right now, taking this in, bringing up a situation, and seeing how it works for them. And then I would say, I don't really see a reason why not. If you find yourself triggered, to try it and see if it's helpful. It might be that you need more than that, and that maybe you need to call a timeout and go find some other kinds of support from someone else or other kinds of self-regulation practices or self-empathy practice. But I don't really see a downside because so long as we're not saying those things out loud, I think it's likely to be helpful. And I think there is something kind of unusual in this particular suggestion, which is that it's a combination of an awareness practice and a disinhibition or a permission. Like that voice, I'm not saying start swearing and cursing if that doesn't come up, but if that's already coming up in you, it's like you find uh, like you create more space inside to like let that wave move through rather than to stay kind of festering and burning inside. And I think so often we're not used to that option of allowing that energetic movement. We're so used to suppressing it or making problems for ourselves and others by just expressing it.
Yeah. And I'm definitely, and I'm reminded now of many experiences of allowing this expression to happen in my head. And I'm thinking now of the Marshall Rosenberg quote of enjoy the jackal party. I think he says in your
Yeah,
head. Um, and I really find, in my experience, it's a really joyful, like it's been a really joyful practice. Also doing it outside of the situation, which I guess is another skill to try and understand my needs. And perhaps you might touch on this process can lead me to my needs, and perhaps that's where you're going in a moment. But just it's like that inhibition, that disinhibition is a very joyful movement. It's like almost this, oh, all of this life energy had been suppressed. It's like, poof, like bubbling over.
yeah,
There's a lot of joy there.
exactly. Exactly. I think so many of us, we've been literally schooled for decades in being good, in being nice, in ways which actually mean like keep, keep yourself under control. And so finally this permission in a safe way to let that life energy come up and not be kept under. And doing it in a safe way, which isn't the reason that, for the inhibition that it's destructive, because we're not taking it in a destructive area, and that's important. And I guess that many, or probably most people who would be listening to this or reading this would be more on the like inhibition side, whereas certain other people, they might need more inhibition because it's not there to begin with. But yeah, then we can go from there into the direction of, okay, we've made more space, we've had that release, even that joy. We've given a little bit a degree of recognition to our reaction, even if we haven't yet gotten into the feelings or the needs. Just allowing it space is a kind of honoring of that part. And that language can be helpful as well, to think of it as a part, and to let that part have a place at the table, to have a voice, to be heard. And then we can move towards, once we have that bit more space and presence, uh, in the moment or later, we can move to actually feeling ourselves more. And in the course, in the foundations course, of course, this is one of the units. So I feel like you're disrespecting me again. That's what I think. I feel is I feel angry, or I feel annoyed, or I feel hurt, or I feel disappointed, or disheartened, or whatever it is. And then I can actually feel that. And feeling that in the body will be helpful as well in coming out of the trigger and into presence, in touch with my humanness, which is where I more want to communicate from if I want to be effective and communicate something that's more likely to land rather than to trigger defensiveness or distance from the other. So, really feeling the feeling, giving it more space in the body, and then letting the feeling take us closer to what is it that's actually important to me here, what we call needs. What is it that's really important? And not trying to figure it out, but like letting ourselves be led to that. And then it's like, oh, reliability. That's just what comes up. And when I feel through and let it come up in that way, then it has a sense of coherence inside me. Like, oh, yeah, it's really about reliability. And just getting that clarity, like the connection between the bottom up feeling and the top down naming, that does something. I think on the level of the brain, it moves um, it it moves that energy and information. I forget where it is, maybe through the hippocampus. Anyway, it's like that something is resolved just by that getting named. You know, that has a regulating impact. And then I'm in a clear, congruent, self-connected place. Like, oh yeah, I'm frustrated because I really want more reliability. And then that's a place from which I might be able to effectively communicate in a helpful way. You know, we won't go into the whole mode of expression. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm loving this, and just took a very spontaneous breath. I know now as kind of listening to you is for me also, having this energy of going down and sinking in. I had this image of just, I don't know, a stone or something being dropped in the water and then just making its way down. A question I had practically is like, okay, so I'm imagining myself in a triggering situation still. This person's triggered me. I've gone inward, had this, watched this wave of thoughts and judgments of this person, let them come without really getting stuck in them and identifying. And then in that connection to myself, going down to feeling a need. So my question is this something that kind of really can happen in the conversation? Um, is this
yeah,
something that can be kind of,
yeah. I'll say a couple of things about that. One is if if there's some heat in the conversation, oftentimes I'll default to catching. Yeah, and once people have really trained in empathy, because there's imprecise ways of doing that, and there's much more precise ways of doing that. But that's a very quick or effective way to bring the other person out of their trigger into more feeling safe and less defensive. And oftentimes it can help me connect to and be touched by what's important to them on the deeper level, even if I still may disagree on the level of position or narrative preference. And then, so I'll often default to catching, and then that may also give more space in the conversation for me to feel myself. And maybe sometimes a timeout is what's needed. If neither of us have enough space to engage fruitfully or to be earnestly in catching mode. But then it's kind of funny you asked that because I just got a message from a friend this morning who said he had a dream about me yesterday. And in the dream, I was in real time expressing honestly what I was experiencing in the moment. That's also my experience not only in dreams, at least some of the time, after many thousands of hours of practice, that, yeah, even when charged, when activated, there are times for sure when I can express live what's happening in terms of my feelings and needs um, in a way that makes a difference. Sometimes that requires really slowing down, and that's, of course, its own skillful habit of having agency and choice around the pace of a conversation and choosing a pace that allows conversation from connection and not just a runaway of habit or reactivity.
yeah, and that to me is another episode or another conversation. But like you're saying here, like then you're talking about throwing in this catching and throwing. Yes, yeah. And if I can take you back to the catching, so you're saying like, okay, I'm just trying to hold the person who asked this question. This is a question that came up often on our registration for the courses. Trying to imagine this person, like really wanting to help them with some, yeah, with some practical steps. So just imagine them, and it's like, okay, so perhaps I've let this wave come up, maybe enjoyed it somewhat. I'm staying connected to my body. I'm present, and there might be a movement in me of like, perhaps it's time to to catch, and I move into focusing on the other person actually and what's important to them underneath what they're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I can offer two sentences that I think would be helpful. Um, Maybe three sentences. One sentence is first to reflect what you're hearing the person wishes on a very practical level. You wish that I would XYZ. That's oftentimes we're thinking in terms of that, what we call the strategy level, or that level of actions, preferences. So just to meet them on that level. And that will likely create some resonance. And say, yeah. And then from that to imagine, well, what would that give them that they value? What's the quality or the need that they would get to experience? And to check that. Yeah. So is it that you really want consideration or like collaboration, help, to be understood, whatever it is? And we're always checking. We're never telling, and we're not asking, what is it that you need in this kind of removed way? We're checking, offering a guess, which implies that whatever it is makes sense and that we're interested in that. So those are two sentences, reflecting the preference or the action that we hear, guessing the underlying need that that would meet. And a third sentence for people who really want competence in this, I would say, is take our course. Or a similar course. But these are things which, like that Aikido master, they really take training. Um, and I think it's valuable to do that in a really structured way.
Yeah.
I would say for me, I think a big reason that I've developed competence to the degree that I have, which is not perfect, but has stood me in good stead, is that I've taught this foundations course dozens of times, and just training the foundations again and again and again and again is so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've been working with you. We've been working together for quite a while, and I often reflect on how valuable it is to hear all of this stuff over and over again. I mean, I've heard this a lot. I've taught it myself, and I often have the experience, as I'm having now, of hearing this, and my body is like, this makes sense. There's a congruence and a yes.
Yes.
And so, yeah, that's just I'm saying, yeah, take our course or a course. But yeah, it's really, it can never be too much of what feels right.
Yeah, and I love that, and I think that's why I feel so passionate about it as well, is because of the sense of congruence that it brings in my body and in relational spaces, and seeing now with hundreds of people, like the way it's not like we're inventing something, we're just pointing things out that help make order or bring clarity that then open the possibilities.
Is there anything else you'd like to, yeah, how does that feeling in terms of, just say the initial question?
Yeah, for me it feels relatively complete. Yep.
Maybe I want to ask you another question. Yeah, if you have the space to answer. You mentioned another option might be asking for a timeout, which is a skill in and of itself. It's probably a unit in an advanced course in and of itself. How could you give some words to that, or just open that up a little
Yeah.
bit more?
Yeah, Mike, I feel super triggered right now, and I'm doubting that us continuing this conversation is going to lead to something helpful and not something that we regret, or and I don't want to go down that route. I suggest we take 20 minutes or a couple hours to breathe, to maybe get some support, go for a walk, whatever, and then come back, so that when we come back, we can hopefully connect in a more connecting way. And yeah, what is your smile saying?
I think I smiled first because I had the thought of like, how could I say no to that? That made me giggle. But it was also, I think, and this is maybe again to say the point, like the skillfulness that you said that. And in the moment of someone being triggered by someone, having access to that, yeah,
Yeah,
frequency is probably going to be quite challenging. So maybe just naming that it's a practice, really.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But if you've practiced that, let's say not 50,000 times, but even 50 or 500, I imagine it won't be so hard. It's like, anybody can learn in a foreign language to say whatever, one sentence. That you don't have to know the whole language. If you just practice that sentence, you can say, "How are you?" and sound maybe even like a native if you practice it.
All right.
All right.
I love that.